Today we're going to talk about something that can be uncomfortable to students from the white middle class, and that's white privilege. But it's important that we talk about it because I want you to understand your position in American society because of your race. So that really my objective for you is for you to just come out of this lecture humble. So that when you have students of color in your classroom, you can be humble in that understanding that their experience probably not been the same as your own, and that they are surviving difficulties that you may not have had to contend with. So just keep that in your mind as a frame of reference as you talk about these ideas. It's not at all to make you feel guilty. It's not to be ashamed of a race. In fact, I want you to be proud of your heritage, be proud to be an American, and because you're American, we fight for equality and justice, and that's a part of who we are in our nation. And so we're going to talk about how we become a more just society by looking at what privilege and subtle racism that still exists in America. So first of all, before we get into dominance, it's important to kind of couch it in a theory, and that's the minimal group paradigm. Minimal group paradigm is a simple idea that we as human beings tend to create in-groups and out-groups when we are looking at people in our community or in any situation. We always have an in-group and out-group, and there's not a lot of reason to create those, but that's just kind of our fallenness as human beings. So we draw distinctions between ourselves and others. And then after that, we then subscribe a sense of superiority and inferiority. Are they better than I am or less than I am? And so it's not just white people that have done this. It's not a white sin, it's a human sin. It comes from our fallenness. So you can see minimal group theory throughout history and in all parts of the world. Any community or culture is going to have minimal group paradigm. So one thing we have to remember in America is that we are, as white people, experiencing the world from our own position of social dominance. Because we were born white, we're in a place in society where white people have the power, and so that has ramifications for us in our daily lives. So we may not have thought about that throughout our lives. You may not even ever consider white dominance until this conversation today, but you're still benefiting from it. And even if you don't want to benefit from it, you can't help but benefit from it unless you change your skin color, because that's just the nature of our American society. Let me know if I'm going too fast, by the way.
You're good.
You can put up your hand or something and say slow down. I get all excited when I talk too fast. So within minimal group paradigm, you can also kind of come up with a couple terms that are helpful, and that's hegemonic groups, and that actually comes from the word hegemony, H-E-G-E-M-O-N-Y, and hegemony means dominance. So a hegemonic group is a dominant group, and that's the people who are disproportionately represented at high positions of authority. And then the negative reference groups are those who are less likely to be in positions of authority in the society. So who do you think would be a hegemonic group in the U.S.? I always think about politics, like who tends to be the people serving in the U.S. Senate or governors and things like that.
Wouldn't it just be like white middle class?
Wealthy.
In what sex?
Men.
Men, yeah. So white middle class men tend to be the hegemonic group in the U.S. Women just below that, white women. And so what would be some negative reference groups, people that are less likely to be in those positions of authority? You can also think even in a school situation, in a high school or even the school where you're working right now, look at the administration.
Mm-hmm.
So who's not represented in administration?
African American.
African Americans, good.
Diverse.
Yeah, people of color, right?
Yeah.
Latinos. We have in the school that you're working at this week a lot of Latino students, and yet I didn't see any Latino. The Latinos were working the desk as secretaries,
But I didn't see
but those are low pay, right? The administration was not. They were all still white. So good. Okay, so this is the part that gets me very excited because it really helped me. Like when I first learned about dominance, it kind of made me feel bad, and then it overwhelmed me. But Gary Howard, and that's the person that created some of the ideas I'm sharing with you today, he came up with 3 dynamics of dominance, and it just made it really clear for me. So I really want you to know these for the midterm and final exam. So the first one is the assumption of rightness. And so that idea is that we as white people just assume we're always right, that the way we live is the right way and the way other people live is wrong, instead of looking at the way they live is cultural and the way we live is cultural. We don't tend to see ourselves as having a culture. We don't see ourselves as racial beings. So an example that I put up here shows, and I believe this was from 2007, if I recall, but preschoolers receiving suspensions by race. Imagine a preschooler being suspended from school anyway. It's kind of ridiculous if you ask me. But here you have the black preschoolers being suspended. So even though the black preschoolers were only about 18% of the population of preschoolers enrolled, they're being suspended for a single time is over 40% versus white, which is about maybe 28%, and then multiple suspensions, almost 50%, versus white, which is about 26%. So they are being suspended from school at a disproportionate ratio. So if you look at the percentage of how many of them there are, it should be about the same across the board, but instead it's much higher, so it's inflated. And what we can glean from this is, why are they being suspended? Well, why did I put this under assumption of rightness? Who are their teachers? What color are their teachers? Typically white. So their white preschool teachers have their own idea about what's right behavior, and their black children come in and are acting the way they've learned from their own home and their churches, and they are being disciplined for that because the white teacher doesn't see that as cultural, they see it as wrong. Do you see?
Mm-hmm.
And so color blindness is a big problem with that. Color blindness is the idea that, and you'll hear this a lot, and you may have thought this yourself, and I'm challenging you on it now, that the idea that I don't see color, I just see people, or God didn't make color, he made people, or he made one race, the human race. For example, you hear all those cliches. Well, when we do that, and that's always, people are saying those things out of good intent, right? But the problem with that is that you're assuming that race is irrelevant. And it's irrelevant to you because you're in a position of power. You have not had, race has never been a problem for you. But for African Americans, it's pretty much always a problem. It's very often a problem. So it is relevant to their life experience. So we can't treat it as invisible or taboo, as you'll see the problem, we treat it as taboo. So for some of us, the idea of being different from one another causes us to be uncomfortable. We don't want to admit that our life is different than someone else's, so we try to pretend it's not there. A lot of white people are afraid to talk about race with friends who are of a different color or ethnicity. And you have to have definitely a level of intimacy with that friend to have those kind of conversations, but they shouldn't. You're going to understand more of their life experience if you do have those conversations. But also, if we don't have those conversations about what their lives are like as black people or Latino or whatever, then we can just go on believing that the world is operating in a just way. Do you see? So it's helping us to keep within that dominance that we're benefiting from. So the colorblindness idea that's in bold here that's really important is, we believe when we're colorblind, we say, well, I don't have a culture, I'm just right, and anyone who diverges from my values or anyone who thinks differently or acts differently is wrong. It's not a cultural thing, it's just wrong. So, for example, a teacher who sends a student to the office for constantly chatting with their neighbor during class says, well, I treat all my students the same. They're chatting when I want them to be quiet. Well, that student, and I've seen this time and time again, that student, if they're African American, go to an African American church. And what do you see? You see the pastor, an African American pastor, saying, I can't hear you. Are you talking, Do you hear me? I didn't get an amen. He's always asking them to respond to what he's saying. So it's a very interactive exchange. And so that's cultural. It's not that they are trying to be disrespectful or off task. And a lot of times, if you just stop and listen to the conversations your African American students are having with that neighbor, it's usually about what you're teaching. You know, they're not off task. That's their way of thinking through and understanding and interacting with the lesson. But yet the white teacher doesn't think that. They think, I see all my students the same. They're all students. They're not black or white, and so all of them are going to act like white people.
Mm-hmm. I've even noticed that in some of my classes is, like, I've seen two kids, because they do centers where they, like, move around different groups, and I've seen two kids sitting next to each other, translating and helping each other out with the books that they're reading when they're supposed to be doing quiet reading time. And so, like, I leave them go, and she'll say, separate. And so I'm kind of like, so I go over and I try and assist them because she won't let them be together.
Mm-hmm. Right, so that was their way of understanding and collaborating. And that's not just, I mean, African American, you can see it very clearly by just going to a church service. But it's also Latino because they have a strong sense of community and helping one another. So I don't know which your students were, but
I've seen it in both.
Yeah, I would say it operates in both situations. So good, thanks. So anyway, I just mentioned that the teacher doesn't realize that the student's acting out of their home culture that's more focused on communalism and also interactive participatory style of conversation rather than my turn to speak, your turn to speak. That doesn't mean that you just drop all your expectations for behavior in the classroom, but instead you don't discipline it. You don't write a student up or click the Dobo or whatever. What is it called? Brooke? Dojo. You know, to take away points from them. But instead, you remind them, you have systems in place to remind them, not warnings, but reminders. And then you also have opportunities frequently to use the Kagan structures, as they mentioned to you, the think, pair, shares, and things like that, so that they do get a chance to talk about what they're learning, because that obviously is a way that they prefer to learn. So the second dynamic of dominance is the luxury of ignorance. So again, we as white people, we're not doing this purposely, but because we're in a position of power, we can choose when and where we're educated, when and where we are housed, like where we're going to live, because we have, from our ancestors, they have placed us in a position where today we're a little bit more financially better off, where we can buy houses and things like that. So, for example, my grandparents lived in inner city Indianapolis, and so when they first were able to buy a house, they moved to the south side of Indianapolis to get out of the inner city. Then my father also lived on the south side of Indianapolis, which is where I grew up, and it became more diverse. We had desegregation. And then also more of a desegregated housing policies happening. So now that the South Side's getting more diverse, my brothers, their generation, moved out of even the South Side of Indianapolis, further out into the rural area, and it's called white flight. They're really, like, literally trying to move away from the poorer neighborhoods or the black neighborhoods or Latino, and so they want to remove themselves from the struggles of others and keep their kids away from that. So that's called the luxury of ignorance. We try to stay away from the struggles of others. We put up in Houston, when I lived in Houston, there were neighborhoods all over the place in Houston that had they were gated communities where you couldn't get in without flashing your card through. So they're trying to keep themselves isolated from minority people. And they're by doing that, they can just, again, be under the bubble of assuming that everyone lives like I do, everyone has the same opportunity that I do, and everyone lives in this really safe environment like my family does. So you can see with the chart that I have on this page that school segregation is still going strong. So there are two different things that we're seing here. First is students that are segregated. So blacks that go to a segregated school is over 70%. For them to be in an intensely segregated, over almost 40% of black students go to an intensely segregated, and that's where it's over 90% black, Latino, students of color, low income. Latinos is even higher. So 80% of Latinos go to a segregated school, and over 40% go to intensely segregated schools. So again, that's the whites are fleeing from those neighborhoods, and that leaves the African Americans and Latinos with the worst schools. They don't have as many resources. The police are inundated, and so they don't maybe get calls responded to as quickly. And then we see things like Ferguson, where there's an uprising in an incident and a lot of rioting. So the minority people, your students of color, don't have the luxury to ignore race and culture issues, because they have to understand our race and understand how to be white in order to survive in this world. So there was a really good clip that I haven't been able to find on YouTube, but it was a TV show that was a documentary that was out several years ago, where there was an African American family and a white family. And they had the African American family put on tons of makeup and have their hair done to look completely white. And then the white family, they made them look completely black. And they went out into the community, I think this was in California, and lived life for 6 weeks as a family of the other color. And then they documented their experiences. And when they were prepping for this, they had the families live together too for the whole experience. And so the African American, the really African American family, was trying to teach the father of the white family, who was becoming a black family. They were trying to teach him how to act black. So he was showing him how to walk and how to greet other black men and how to talk to them. And then the white mother said, "Oh, this is just so much fun." She said, "What can we teach you about being white?" And the mother, the African American mother, said, "You don't need to teach me anything about being white. I've had, play in your world my whole life." So that's that luxury of ignorance, that the blacks have always had to know about our world, but we have not, unless we really make an initiative, we don't have to know anything about their experiences. And so we also structure schooling in a way that perpetuates a division between blacks and whites, so that your white people don't have to know what the experiences are of black people. You read the article a while ago by Paula Harris, and there she described, I think it was her daughter's school, that had like 3 floors. And do you remember who was on the basement? Which type of students were in the basement? Do you remember? Yes, and what level of learning were they?
They were like the lowest.
Yes, they were the special needs students, the lowest level of track. They were in the basement. They were African American. And then who was at the highest level? Who was on the 3rd floor?
White.
And what were their classes?
Honors, AP,
Yes.
the highest level.
Exactly. So that's an example of tracking how the college prep classes tend to be more white disproportionately, and the black and Latino tend to be special ed disproportionately and low income. There are few black students in honors classes. In 2007, African American students were nearly or greater than twice as likely as white students to be classified with emotional or intellectual disabilities. So again, that goes back to, especially with emotional, that assumption of rightness. If they're not acting our way, we assume they have an emotional disability, instead of that part of that may be cultural. But also we tend to segregate ourselves by putting them into those lower tracks. Now, why do you think we put them into the lower tracks to begin with? Practically speaking, what happens in those early grades? This might be a hard question to ask you as sophomore and freshman, but what happens when we come into kindergarten? What's the difference between white middle class students and possibly low income students or students of color? Or
Preschool. or like
Mhm.
preschool daycare, depending on if they've been educated, if
Exactly.
their parents have been able to work with them,
Mm-hmm.
or
That's exactly it. So, when they come into kindergarten, if they haven't had preschool yet, then they can very easily be assumed to be special needs, and so or ELL too can often become mislabeled as special ed. So then we track them into special ed classes, inclusion classes, and those classes move slower than the college prep, and it snowballs until you've just created a destiny for the student that is very hard to escape. The last dynamic of dominance is the legacy of privilege, which is the idea that we have had passed down to us from our ancestors privilege. And it's not anything that we personally earned, but we get to benefit from it, again, because we're white. So this is invisible to us. I've heard one writer describe it as a fish in water. The fish is not aware of the water, but yet they benefit from it. And so we're swimming around in white privilege, but we aren't even aware that we're experiencing it or earning or using it. And it's unearned, and that's something that sometimes our Grovers struggle with, that they think they've earned everything that they have. But even the fact that you're at Grove City College, you may have worked hard in high school, but I can give you a list of African Americans that I know worked hard in high school too, but didn't get into Grove City College because their schools were less than adequate. And so even though they worked hard and got A's and B's and were in honors classes, their SAT scores were low because those schools were had subpar teachers. And that, is actually a fact, that you're more likely to go to school with poor teachers if you're black or a student of color. We also have the advantage of feeling good about ourselves because we are the dominant group in the U.S. I had a student who talked about when he walked into a classroom. He was a high school student. He said, he was African American. He said, every time I walk through a classroom and see a new teacher, I think to myself, is she going to give me a chance, or does she think I'm just another thug? So he's always wondering what they think about him, and he feels like he has to prove himself to be against the stereotype. Whereas I, as a white middle-class girl, have never had that kind of pressure walking into a classroom. And then white privilege also allows us to be less likely to be touched by poverty. Of course, we all know that there's plenty of poverty among white people, but it's just less likely to happen. And here's an example of the difficulty for African Americans to get jobs. There's still not equity in getting jobs. What you see on this chart is the mean or the average callback rates by the sound of their name. If they have a white sounding name, then they have almost 3.5% chance, more of a chance of getting called back, versus if they have their African American sounding name, they only have about 6.5%, maybe 7% chance of being called back. Also, just looking at some other examples of privilege, this has been something that has always bothered me. It's bothered my conscience or my sense of justice. The prisoners under the state jurisdiction sentenced for drug offenses by race in 2011, there were 40% black versus under about 28% white. Okay, but this is for drug offenses. So look at this next slide. The percent of people who use these drugs by race, and so we break down all the types of drugs, only crack is used by more blacks than whites. So even though, again, going back to the previous slide, wait. Oops. Okay, so let's take a second to look at this and unpack it. So marijuana, whites are using it at a rate of about 47% to blacks 40%. Crack, white, that's the one that blacks use more. So they're at 5%, and we're about 3.8, I believe it said. Cocaine, though, whites use it at about 17%, and blacks use it just under 10%. However, they're going to jail for drug offenses more often than whites. Again, see, and that's a huge, especially if you consider the fact that there are, blacks are only about 17% of the overall population, and yet 40% are going to jail, versus whites are a much larger percentage of the population, and they are less than 30%. So, even though we use drugs illegally more than they do, they go to jail for it more often. So that's the legacy of privilege that allows for that. For one, I can give you an example from my own life. It's, not a very, thing I'm proud of, but my brother, one of my brothers went to jail for drugs, and my dad was good friends with the drug judge of Indianapolis. So he didn't have to serve much time, so just the fact that he's white, my dad's white, means he's more likely to be friends with the person in authority in that situation, which is also white, and so he can get his son out of it. You're also more likely, because whites have more money in U.S. Economy, and so you're more likely to be able to hire a good lawyer, versus blacks have to rely on the state-appointed attorney, who's not going to work as hard for them because they're, not getting extra pay for it. Okay, so now, you saw this for a moment, I'm sorry, but what I like, too, about Gary Howard's work, which, again, this is from Gary Howard, is that he doesn't just leave it as us thinking, oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed, I'm white, look at what we do. It's not about feeling ashamed at all. Instead, it's about recognizing that what we have, some of it is from the benefit of our ancestors, not just from what we have done ourselves. And so he offers 4 steps to dealing with the privilege that we have, so that we can move our society forward to be more just. So the first one, and it actually spells out the word heal, because I changed it a little bit from what Gary Howard did. But anyway, the first step is honesty, that we need to challenge the assumption of rightness. Remember, both assumption of rightness and luxury of ignorance are 2 of those types of dominance. So assumption of rightness, when we just assume we are right about something, instead we should take a step back and say, wait, maybe it's a cultural thing. So when you see people acting a way that you wouldn't act yourself, instead of saying they're weird, say, oh, maybe it's their culture. Okay? It's not that my culture is better, but it's just different. And with the luxury of ignorance, how can we challenge our own luxury of ignorance? Can you give a concrete way that you could challenge your own? Remember, luxury of ignorance is where we pull ourselves away and keep ourselves isolated from others so we don't have to think about the difficulty that they're having. So what would be a way to combat that?
I think part of it is just really being aware of other cultures, especially like your students' culture, so that whenever they're acting out in a way that you might not understand, you can just think about their culture and apply it to them.
So maybe researching a little bit other cultures. Good. Any other ideas?
That's about all I could think
Okay.
of.
Just giving yourself opportunities to be out there with other cultures. Going to a church that's more diverse, for example. Choosing to student teach in a more diverse school district, like Florida, or choosing, an intercession class that is, Detroit or, somewhere else. So getting yourself out there in a way, making friends who are different than you. One time, I'll just tell you a funny story. I don't suggest this, but when we moved to Grove City, that was something that I really mourned, is the lack of diversity, because everywhere else we had lived, we had wonderful diversity. And so my son always was growing up with African Americans and a lot of Asian Indians and other Asians and Latinos were all his friends. And then we came to Grove City and everyone's white. And so I remember one day I saw some Asian Indians walking down the road in Grove City, and I was just so tempted to roll down my window and ask them to be my son's friends, because they had a son, and I didn't want to embarrass them, so I didn't do it. But don't have to you don't have to stalk someone to become your friend, but like try to make friends with people who have a different life experience than you. That's a good idea. Okay. So we also have to learn to question our own assumptions and acknowledge that we have a limited perception of what's true. That what we see, and I'm not talking about your Christian faith, because that's an absolute truth. Okay, I'm not saying that at all. But looking at the way we behave in situations and acknowledging that maybe it's not always the best way. For example, I think that we as white middle class people tend to be passive aggressive. We talk about people behind their backs and then put on a big smiley face in front of them. Or we undermine people because we don't believe in what they're doing, instead of confronting the situation and dealing with it. So to me, I am refreshed by African Americans who you always know where you stand with them. That was my experience with teaching them. So understanding that what you have always thought was the way to behave may not be the best way. Our attention to materialism in the white middle class, I don't think is something that we should be promoting, but yet we do. And so other cultures are not fixated on material possessions as much as we are. Also, as teachers, it's important that you demand honest teaching. If you're a social studies teacher, teaching with multiple perspectives. If you're an English teacher, using multiple perspectives by giving other authors from other ethnicities and races fair representation in your coursework. I'm not a fan of I'm not even a fan of Black History Month, honestly, because to me, Black history and Black literature should have their own respected space in our curriculum already. They are a very big part of our country. They're as big of a part of our country as European Americans are, and so they should be where they were in history. And so same with the literature. I can't talk about American literature 20th century without having the Harlem Renaissance in a unit, and many other authors before and since. So it's not necessarily that you should trickle a bunch of little pieces of other ethnic groups into your curriculum, but put them where they belong. I'm not a big fan in math class of putting in foreign names for the math problems. In actuality, research shows if you just use the word you, Y-O-U, in the math problems, the students actually are more likely to get it right. So it's not about political correctness. It's about being honest in your representation of our multiple races that we have here in the U.S. The second step to the healing response is empathy. And so this, again, builds off the last step of getting out there and learning what the experiences are of others. But if you go, for example, to a church that's diverse, become friends with people and become well enough friends with them that you really can feel with them. So I have here the 3 Cups of Tea as an example, because if you've read that book, I saw Greg Mortensen speak. He's the author of 3 Cups of Tea, and he talked about how he set up a school in Afghanistan. But before he even did that, he found himself in an Afghanistan village, and they invited him in for a cup of tea. And he said, with the first cup of tea, we were strangers. By the second cup, we were friends. And by the third cup of tea, we were family. And you'll do anything for family. So become friends with people who are different than you, and then know them, invest in that relationship well enough that you're willing to fight for them. So that's just, to me, that's what being a Christian is about. But some students went to a conference in September or October, I think, down at Geneva College, and they said that a speaker talked about how, and I've heard this a lot, that the United States of America is most segregated on Sundays. Our churches are incredibly segregated. And so we as Christians should be trying to become friends with people very different from ourselves so that we can understand their situation better and walk alongside them in their struggles. Okay. And then advocacy. is the third one. So again, this kind of builds off it, because if you have empathy with a student, or not just a student, people, if you empathize with them deeply, you're going to want to fight for them, okay? Because they're your family, and you're going to fight for your family, right? So you're going to fight for your friends. So that means advocating for them, because you have the power to advocate for them. And as teachers, you're going to have that power, because you'll know how the schools operate, whereas your low-income parents and parents from other countries as well, they don't understand the American educational system, or they may be afraid of it or overwhelmed by it. So you can use your power as a teacher to help them. When I was teaching, I had a math and reading center after school, and so I wasn't teaching in a classroom for a couple years because I was building my business. And I would go into parent-teacher conferences with parents. They'd ask me to go with them because they were so overwhelmed and afraid. They didn't know what to say, and they didn't know how to advocate for their child. So I did that for them. That doesn't mean I went in there with my guns blazing, telling the teachers this is the way it's going to be. But I listened and then shared with them where the child was coming from and what we were doing with the child. So the parent could see a way to talk with people, in a way to get what you need, but also to advocate for yourself in a civil and professional way. So how are some other ways that you can think that you could advocate for your students or their parents?
I think with the students, sometimes, and I know I was talking to my teacher at the school, that some of the students just don't have parents, and due to they're just so timid to come into the school because they don't understand it, so they just totally step away. And the teacher said that she knows for a couple of the students that have parents that don't come to the school, that she has to kind of represent their parents for them at school. And sometimes that means just telling them exactly how it is and being that person that they have to, answer to while they're at school. And that really helps the responsibility.
Okay. Good.
I would even say, kind of like how they sent out that letter today in the different languages, that makes the school not seem so far off, like I'm sending my kid to outer space to get an education. Putting the letter in their own language so that they understand it the best, I feel like that's a way to almost reach out to the parents too, so that they have an understanding of what's going on for their kids at their school, so they're able to communicate with their kids, because their kids aren't going to be able to say, oh yeah, we've learned this, this, and this today. Because I know when my mom would ask me, what'd you learn at school today? Nothing. That was just my automatic response. So these kids might be doing the same thing. That's how you can fight for the kids, so that their parents have a connection.
Yes, absolutely. That's excellent. And so also that just made me think too about, I don't know that you were in the meeting that I was in yet, but the principal was with us, and she said that she teaches Love and Logic, which is a really great book about discipline. And she does a training session with the parents on Love and Logic. And so having parent meetings offered maybe even once a month on different topics related to raising children in the U.S. Can be really helpful to them. At the school in London where I took students, there was a woman who, that was her whole job. She was a parent liaison. And she would even teach them how to speak English, because if the parents knew how to speak English, they were more likely to come into the school. And she taught them English there at the school, so that again they would drop off their children in the morning, and she would literally run after them and ask them to come into her little classroom, and then she got them to warm up to the school, and then they're more likely to engage in the school. And she would also go over some of the homework and types of things that the students were doing. So that the parents understood and could help the child with the homework. So great. And then lastly, with advocacy, we have to be assertive enough to educate our own culture about privilege. So this is really important for you at Grove City College, to, when you hear someone saying something judgmental about another culture, step in and say something about it. Don't be afraid to call the person out. I just over Christmas break, I was at home with my brothers, and I saw the Annie movie, the new Annie, and I posted on Facebook that it was excellent. I loved it. My daughter loved it, and my brother went off about why would they make Annie black? They're desecrating this important part of American culture. And so I argued with him about it. I'm not just going to let him say that, and so just really being willing to stand. And the way to do that, I think, is to think about your friends who are of that group that they are denigrating. And I'm fighting for that friend with this conversation. So those are hard conversations. In my family, like I've mentioned, my family can be pretty racist, the family I grew up with. And so I've had to have hard conversations with them. And my dad as well, he's passed away now, but I would go head to head with him pretty often over it. But I'm not going to be silent. I'm just not. So. And then the last one, heal, is L, lead. So Gary Howard called it action, but I changed it to lead because, for one thing, it spells heal, which I think is fun. But also, what's the difference between action and lead? Just like the implications of each word.
It's one thing to like take an action and do something, but when you're leading, then you're setting an example and you're getting others to follow you too. It's more of like a ripple effect.
Excellent. That's very well said. Awesome. Okay, I don't have anything to add to that because that's exactly right. So with one thing we have to think as teachers is that every choice that you make in the classroom has a political effect. So if I choose, well, for example, my husband, when he was student teaching, he was social studies, and he was all excited to get to the civil rights era because we had all kinds of really cool simulations he was going to do, and he had some other ideas, and he was going to bring in some protest songs and things like that. And his cooperating teacher said, "You have a day and a half to teach the civil rights era." That was a political act. She didn't probably acknowledge that, but it was, because she made the decision to limit a lesson on the civil rights to a day and a half, whereas it needed probably 2 weeks at least. So every decision you make in teaching is political. So you need to decide what is important, and where do these decisions fall in line with my philosophy. And by your philosophy, it's not just of teaching, but what do you believe about the nature of students? What do you believe about the nature of education? And what do you believe about where you want society to move? Okay, and those things should be ingrained in you so that you are always making decisions that are in line with that philosophy. So also with that, your action should be to teach students about racism and prejudice. In age 4, if you have preschoolers. My daughter said one day, to my dismay, we have close friends that are African American. Her babysitter that lived with us was African American. She loves the show Doc McStuffins, which has an African American main character. And yet we were at a basketball game, and our friends that were sitting to the left of us. The husband is African American, and the wife is white. And my daughter said, "Mommy, I'm glad I don't have brown skin." And I was mortified. And I said, but instead of like hushing her up because I was embarrassed, I said, "Well, why would you say that?" And I named off people who had brown skin that she loved. And she said, "Well, yeah, that's true." So, hopefully that, that'll change her. I don't know where that came from, honestly. But sometimes it's just a matter of doing that with young ones. To when they're in 4th or 5th grade, you can really start having some hard conversations about race and prejudice when you're talking about whether it's Thanksgiving, giving them more of an accurate picture of what happened in Thanksgiving, or what, Thanksgiving, some of the things behind the scenes that were happening, or looking at slavery, having students read about slavery. I remember reading about Harriet Tubman in 4th grade. So just really taking the time for that. But then also when race and prejudice become an issue, whether it's on the news because of Ferguson, for example, that's been on the news all last semester, or in your school. Like my school had an issue in Tennessee because African American students wanted to all wear white shirts to show their solidarity with some black kids in Louisiana who were suspended from school because they got into a fight with white kids who put a noose up in a tree to say that they were going to hang the black kids. So the black kids defended themselves. They got suspended and the white kids didn't. So it was big in the news. And so my African American students wanting to wear white shirts, and they were not allowed to. By administration, they said no. So instead of acting like that's not happening outside my classroom, I stopped class for about 15 minutes and we talked about it in a civil way. So don't be afraid to talk about those issues as a teacher. And then also, like I mentioned on, I think it was the third, the advocacy, but taking action by speaking out against racism when you see it happening around you, but also within your school. If you see some unjust structural things happening, then talk to your assistant principal or your principal and encourage them to make a change. Okay, this next slide is just Gary Howard's 5 key arenas for learning. So looking at our multicultural ed process, so what we should be going through ourselves. We're going to go over it really quickly. I just want to share it with you because it's very similar to James Banks' 5 dimensions of multicultural education and Christine Bennett's 6 goals of a multicultural education. So just knowing who you are racially and culturally. So think about what that sounds like with Christine Bennett, which of her goals that is. Learn about and value cultures different from your own. Again, that echoes Christine Bennett. View social reality through multiple perspectives. That should be both Christine Bennett and James Banks. He has something similar to that. And then understanding the history and dynamics of dominance. And lastly, social justice and social action. And we'll talk more about social action with service learning later in the semester. And then racial identity development is just the idea. I just put a few things on here that I want you to think about. One is that race is a social construct. Only less than 3% of our genetic makeup is race specific. So very little of who we are has to do with our race, and we make it meaningful by the way we interact with others based on their race. And so everyone identifies to a different degree with both their race and culture. I'm Italian, but I'm not as Italian as my cousins because they grew up in an all-Italian community. So I grew up in I grew up in a more diverse city, so we just didn't have that. I'm losing and then remembering that we don't tend to see ourselves as racial beings, but race does matter in the U.S. because our life experiences have been different because of race. But we'll talk about with the 9 dimensions of Afroculturalism. We'll talk about how some, for example, African Americans have had different experiences with their race because of where they lived in the U.S., and that's definitely true as well. Okay, sorry about all the additions there. So in this last slide, it's just the achievement triangle. So this is kind of neat from Gary Howard. It's the idea of basically 3 things that can help to frame your pedagogy or your teaching. Rigor, relationship, and responsiveness. So with relationships, you hear that a lot in the Ed Department at Grove City College. The way you connect with your students needs to be culturally relevant. So having a passion for equity, believing that your students should have justice in their education, having cultural competence. So I think one of you mentioned earlier about knowing the student's culture so that you understand it better is important for how you relate to them. Then rigor also has to do with that passion for equity and cultural responsive teaching. By that I mean with rigor, you want your students, all of your students, to have academic excellence. You're not going to change your expectations, lower them for African Americans or Latinos. And then the cultural responsive teaching will allow you to have that rigor, because if you're responding to their culture, then you can move them forward to be successful. And responsiveness also is just being culturally responsive in general. So knowing your practice, knowing how to be culturally responsive, which is what we're talking about in this class, knowing your students better, and then knowing yourself. And that means knowing who you are as a racial being, and your experience of privilege in the U.S. is important. All of that's important for you to become a teacher who can really transform society by getting all of our students to have a truly excellent education so that they can do whatever God has called them to. Okay, and so the last slide is just, one thing, again, I stress this, that it's not about blaming white people. Dominance has happened all over the world, and it's happening all over the world today. The difference is, in the U.S., we are people who believe in justice for all, and so we're always trying to become better. Okay. Instead, we need to see that our enemy is dominance, ignorance, and racism. And so we want to keep our students from being ignorant to race issues or becoming racist. So we want to combat that throughout what we do in the classroom. And so this last page is just, if you want to read the book by Gary Howard, he'll probably tick you off a little bit if you're a Christian. But it is a good read, especially if you're going to be a white teacher in a very diverse school. He really kind of will help you understand who you are in understanding within a multiracial setting. So the book is called "We Can't Teach What We Don't Know: White Teachers, Multiracial Schools." So it's a great read, but there are parts of it that I disagree with, and that's why I just share it with you as a lecture so I can pull out the gems out of the book. But anyway, it's there for you in case you want to read it. Okay, thank you, and have a great day. Oh, any questions? Thank you. Okay.